Clean it, or you're out." The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and final, in the polished hallway of Hayes Global's headquarters, where every surface gleamed like it had something to prove. Claire Whitman didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Authority dripped from every syllable as she flicked a folded rag toward the man standing in front of her, a man dressed in a plain charcoal hoodie, worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. Jordan Hayes didn't reach for the rag right away. He just looked at it, then at her, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that didn't match the moment. Around them, the morning rush slowed just enough to notice. A few employees lingered by the glass corridor, coffee cups paused midair, eyes scanning the scene with quiet curiosity. Some smirked. Some avoided eye contact. Most said nothing. Claire crossed her arms, her posture sharp, practiced, the kind that came from years of being obeyed without question. "You don't belong upstairs," she added, her tone cool, dismissive, as if she were stating a fact everyone else had already agreed on. Jordan's gaze shifted past her for half a second, catching his reflection in the mirrored wall behind the reception desk. For a brief moment, time stretched. He'd seen this before. Different building, different faces. Same assumption. Same quiet decision made about who he was before he ever spoke. He stepped forward, not in protest, not in compliance, but with a stillness that seemed to press against the air itself. The restroom door swung open with a soft click, fluorescent lights humming overhead like a low warning. Inside, the space was spotless, almost sterile, the kind of place cleaned more for image than necessity. Jordan stood there, just inside the threshold, the rag still in his hand now, his reflection staring back at him from the wide mirror above the sink. For a second, something flickered behind his eyes. A memory. A younger version of himself, standing in another lobby years ago, hearing the same words dressed in different language. Not executive material. Not the right fit. Not what we're looking for. The reflection didn't change, but something behind it did. Outside, Claire's heels tapped impatiently against the tile. "We don't have all day," she called out, her voice carrying just enough to pull more attention from passing employees. A young analyst nearby, badge still new enough to shine, hesitated, glancing between Claire and the man in the restroom. "Hey, maybe we should," he started, but his voice faded under the weight of everyone else's silence. Jordan lowered his gaze from the mirror and reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with a movement so casual it almost went unnoticed. No rush, no tension, just precision. His thumb hovered for a fraction of a second before tapping the screen. The call connected instantly. "Board online," he said quietly, his voice level, controlled, as if he were asking about something routine, something expected. On the other side of the door, Claire let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Who do you think you're calling?" she replied, shaking her head, already turning away as if the situation had resolved itself in her favor. But the building didn't move the way it had a moment ago. Conversation slowed. Screens along the hallway flickered, just for a second, like a system waking up. Jordan stepped back out into the corridor, dropping the rag onto the polished floor without looking at it. His eyes met Claire's again, steady, unshaken, and for the first time, something in her expression shifted, not understanding, not yet, but something close to it. The air tightened, and somewhere above them, unseen but very real, the first names began to appear. The hallway did not return to normal. It could not. Something invisible had shifted, like the air itself had been given instructions no one could hear, but everyone could feel. Claire Whitman slowed her steps, her heels no longer striking the floor with the same certainty. She glanced up at the nearest wall screen, then back at Jordan, her eyes narrowing as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to stay still. "What did you just do?" she asked, her voice no longer sharp, but not yet uncertain enough to admit doubt. Jordan did not answer immediately. He stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, posture steady, as if he had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. Around them, employees who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. A conversation near the glass conference room cut off mid-sentence. Someone lowered their phone slowly, forgetting what they had been typing. The young analyst who had spoken earlier took a cautious step closer, his voice quieter now. "Sir, are you supposed to be here?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have, not because it was unclear, but because no one wanted to be the first to hear the answer. Jordan turned his head slightly toward him, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. That depends, he said, his tone even measured. Who decides where someone belongs? The words did not rise in volume, but they traveled, reaching ears that had not intended to listen. Claire let out a short breath, trying to regain control of the moment. We decide that, she said quickly, stepping forward again, reclaiming space with practiced authority. That is how this company operates. Structure. Order. You cannot just walk in off the street and start making calls like you own the place. Jordan's eyes met hers again, steady, unflinching. Interesting choice of words, he replied quietly. Before Claire could respond, the nearest screen flickered again, this time longer, brighter. The company logo dissolved, replaced by a dark interface that very few people in the building had ever seen. Names began appearing in the corner of the display, one after another, each accompanied by a title that carried weight far beyond the hallway they stood in. Chief Financial Officer, Head of Legal, Board Chair. The analyst's eyes widened as he read them, his voice barely above a whisper. Those are executives. A low murmur spread through the corridor, subtle but unmistakable. Claire turned sharply toward the screen, her composure slipping for the first time. This is a system error, she said, more to herself than anyone else, already pulling out her phone as if she could fix it by force. But the screen did not glitch. It stabilized, and then it did something no one in that hallway had ever seen before. A live feed began to load. Jordan's phone buzzed softly in his hand. He glanced down at it, then back up, his gaze moving across the room like he was taking inventory, not of people, but of decisions. The analyst stepped back slightly, as if realizing he had been standing too close to something important. Claire's voice came back, tighter now. Who are you calling? She demanded, her words sharper, but no longer confident enough to cut. Jordan slipped his phone back into his pocket with deliberate ease. Not calling, he said. Connecting. The word landed differently. Not louder, not stronger, but heavier. Claire's grip tightened around her own phone. You are interfering with internal operations, she said, leaning on policy like it could still protect her. That is grounds for immediate removal. A few employees nodded instinctively, clinging to the familiarity of rules, but no one moved to enforce them, because the room no longer felt like it belonged to those rules. Jordan took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to shift the center of gravity in the space. You keep talking about operations, he said, his voice calm, almost reflective. But you have not once asked what they are operating for. The screen behind him brightened fully now, the live feed snapping into clarity. Faces appeared, one by one, each framed in a clean digital window, each looking directly into the camera as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. The hallway fell silent, completely this time. Claire turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the screen, her expression finally giving way to something real. Not anger, not authority, recognition trying to form before it was too late. And Jordan, still standing in the same spot where she had handed him a rag minutes earlier, did not look at the screen at all. He was watching her. No one spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because something deeper had taken hold of the room, something that made every word feel like it might land in the wrong place. The screen behind Jordan was no longer just a display. It had become a presence. Faces filled it now, clear and undeniable, each one composed, focused, watching. The board chair leaned slightly forward on the screen, her expression calm but unmistakably serious. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses, eyes scanning the room through the camera as if he could see every detail. And then there was the head of legal, already taking notes. Claire Whitman did not move. Her phone was still in her hand, but her grip had loosened, her confidence slipping through her fingers in real time. This is not possible, she said quietly, the words more breath than statement. The young analyst took another step back, his voice barely holding together. That is the board, he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might change it. A few employees shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of where they were standing, who they were standing near, and what they had just witnessed minutes earlier. Jordan remained still, his posture unchanged, his presence steady like something anchored beneath the surface. He had not raised his voice once. He had not argued. He had not defended himself. And yet the entire building now felt like it was responding to him. The board chair spoke first, her voice coming through the speakers with quiet authority. "We are live," she said, her tone controlled, precise. "Proceed." The word did not echo, but it settled over the hallway like a final instruction. Claire's eyes snapped toward the screen, then back to Jordan, her mind racing to connect the pieces she had already scattered. "Wait," she said, stepping forward again, but slower this time, careful, as if the ground itself had changed. "There has to be some misunderstanding." Jordan finally shifted his weight, just slightly, enough to signal that something was about to move forward. His gaze met hers again, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. "There was," he said calmly. "Just not the kind you think." The head of legal looked up from her notes on the screen. "We have been monitoring the situation since activation," she said, her voice steady, factual. "Audio, visual, and system logs are all recorded." A ripple moved through the employees in the hallway, subtle but undeniable. People began replaying moments in their heads. The rag hitting the floor, the words that had been said. Without hesitation, the silence that had followed. Claire shook her head slightly, as if trying to push the reality away. "I was enforcing policy," she said quickly, reaching for something familiar, something safe. "We have protocols for unauthorized individuals." Jordan took one step closer, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance completely. "You keep calling it policy," he said, his voice low measured. "But policy does not decide who deserves respect. People do." The words did not need emphasis. They carried themselves. On the screen, the chief financial officer leaned forward slightly. "Identity confirmation has been completed," he stated, his tone neutral but final. "Jordan Hayes, majority owner, acting chief executive officer, effective 48 hours ago." The hallway did not just go quiet. It emptied of sound entirely, like something had been pulled out of it. The analyst's mouth parted, but no words came out. A woman near the back covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide. Claire did not blink. For a moment, she simply stood there, the title echoing in her mind, refusing to settle. Jordan did not look at the screen. He did not need to. He looked at her. "You asked who decides who belongs," he said quietly. "Now you have your answer." And in that moment, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down all at once, not with force, but with certainty, leaving no room for denial, no space to step back. Only the realization that the man she had dismissed, redirected, and reduced to a role he never held had been standing in front of her the entire time as the one person she could not afford to misjudge. Claire Whitman's lips parted, but whatever response she had prepared dissolved before it reached the air. The title had landed, and it did not leave room for interpretation. Around her, the hallway had transformed from a place of routine into something closer to a courtroom, where every glance carried judgment and every second stretched longer than it should. No one moved to help her. No one stepped in to soften what had just been confirmed. Because there was nothing to soften. The truth had already taken its place. Jordan Hayes stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, but now the space adjusted to him, not the other way around. The same man, the same clothes, the same quiet presence, yet everything about how he was seen had shifted in an instant. The analyst who had questioned him earlier lowered his gaze, replaying his own words in his head, realizing how small they sounded now. A few employees who had smirked before now stood rigid, their expressions tightened by the weight of what they had witnessed. Claire finally found her voice, but it no longer carried the sharp edge it once did. "If this is some kind of test," she said carefully, each word measured as if stepping across fragile ground, then it was not communicated through the proper channels. She reached for structure again, for policy, for anything that might restore control. Jordan's expression did not change. "That is the point," he replied quietly. "What people do when they think no one important is watching." The words settled heavily, not just on Claire, but on everyone within earshot, because they all understood what he meant. This was not about a mistake. It was about a pattern. On the screen behind him, the head of legal spoke again, her voice precise and unyielding. "We have identified multiple statements made within the last 10 minutes that indicate bias in role assignment and workplace conduct," she said. "All of it has been logged." A subtle ripple moved through the group. Employees who had said nothing suddenly became aware that silence was not the same as absence, that watching without intervening still counted. Claire straightened slightly, forcing her shoulders back as if posture alone could restore her authority. "I was maintaining operational standards," she insisted, though the conviction in her voice had thinned. "We cannot allow unauthorized personnel to access restricted areas." Jordan took another step forward, not invading, not aggressive, but deliberate enough that no one could ignore it. "You did not ask who I was," he said, his tone steady. "You decided what I was." That distinction cut deeper than anything else. Claire's eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the floor where the rag still lay, untouched, a small detail that now carried more meaning than anyone wanted to admit. The chief financial officer spoke next, his voice calm, almost detached. "Internal access logs show no attempt was made to verify identity before assigning task duties," he stated. "That is not procedure." The statement did not accuse. It confirmed, and confirmation was harder to argue against than opinion. Claire's breath caught slightly as she processed it. For the first time, she did not have an immediate response. Around her, the employees shifted again, the invisible lines between them redrawn in real time. The analyst stepped back completely now, as if distancing himself from the moment might somehow separate him from it. Jordan's gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in each reaction, each realization, each quiet recalibration of where people stood. Then it returned to Claire. "This building runs on more than policies," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "It runs on judgment. And today, yours was on full display." The words did not rise, but they carried weight that pressed into the silence. On the screen, the board chair leaned forward slightly, her presence sharpening. "We are ready to proceed with executive action," she said, "awaiting your directive." The hallway seemed to hold its breath. Claire's eyes widened just slightly, the full implication beginning to take shape in her mind. Not confusion anymore, not denial, something closer to realization. And Jordan, standing in the same place where she had tried to assign him a task minutes earlier, did not rush the moment. He let it sit, let it settle, let everyone understand exactly where they stood before anything changed. Because what came next would not just correct a mistake. It would define what happened after it. The silence did not break. It deepened. It settled into the walls, into the glass, into every pair of eyes that now refused to look away. Claire Whitman stood at the center of it, no longer directing the room but held inside it, as if the very structure she once controlled had turned and locked around her. The screen behind Jordan remained steady, the board members watching without interruption, without emotion, the kind of attention that did not need to be loud to be absolute. Jordan Hayes did not move immediately. He let the weight of the moment finish its work, because understanding, real understanding, could not be rushed. It had to land fully. He glanced once at the rag on the floor, then back at Claire, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes had sharpened, not with anger, but with clarity that could not be mistaken. "You gave me a task," he said calmly. Without a question, without a pause. Claire swallowed, her throat tightening as the words reached her differently now, no longer something she could deflect. "I was following what made sense in the moment," she replied. But even as she spoke, the sentence felt thinner than it had in her head. Jordan nodded once, acknowledging the answer without accepting it. "That is exactly how bias works," he said. "It feels like logic until someone asks you to explain it." A few employees shifted again, the truth of that statement landing closer to them than they expected. The analyst lowered his head further, his earlier hesitation now turning into quiet regret. On the screen, the head of legal adjusted her posture slightly. "We are prepared to initiate corrective measures based on the findings," she said. "This includes immediate review of leadership conduct and role assignment authority." Claire's eyes flickered back to the screen, then to Jordan, the reality closing in from both directions. "This does not need to escalate," she said quickly, her voice tightening, reaching for control that was no longer within reach. "We can resolve this internally." Jordan's gaze held steady. "This is internal," he replied. "You are just seeing it from the other side now." The distinction landed harder than anything before it, because it removed any illusion that this was external pressure. This was the system, looking at itself. The chief financial officer spoke again, his tone unchanged. "Executive authority is required to proceed with action," he said, awaiting confirmation. The words were simple, but they carried a finality that shifted the entire room forward by one irreversible step. Claire's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. Not visibly enough to call out, but enough that everyone felt it. Her shoulders, once squared with certainty, now held tension that had nowhere to go. Her eyes moved briefly across the employees, searching for something familiar, something supportive, but found only distance. Because the room had already moved on from her version of it. Jordan exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but with the calm of someone who had already decided what came next long before this moment arrived. He stepped forward one final time, closing the space completely, not to intimidate, but to make sure there was no confusion left between them. "This was never about a restroom," he said quietly. "It was about who you thought deserved to be in this building." The words settled, undeniable. Claire opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because there was nothing left that could change what had already been revealed. Jordan turned slightly, just enough to face the screen behind him, acknowledging the presence that had been watching from the beginning. "You have everything you need," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "Proceed." The word did not echo, but it moved through the system instantly. On the screen, the board chair gave a single nod. The head of legal reached forward, her hand moving with practiced precision. Somewhere in the building, unseen but immediate, access began to shift. Credentials prepared to change. Authority ready to be reassigned. And in the hallway, where it had all started with a single assumption and a simple command, the consequences finally began to take shape, not loudly, not chaotically, but with a quiet certainty that could not be reversed. It did not happen all at once. There was no loud alarm, no dramatic interruption, no sudden chaos. The shift began quietly, almost politely, like the system itself was too precise to make a scene. Claire Whitman's phone buzzed in her hand. Once, then again. She glanced down instinctively, expecting a message she could control, something she could respond to. But what she saw did not ask for a response. Access updated. The words were simple, neutral, but they carried a weight that pressed deeper than any accusation. Her thumb hovered over the screen, trying to open her internal dashboard, but the interface did not respond the way it always had. It paused, then refreshed, then denied. Her credentials no longer matched the authority she thought she held. Around the hallway, a few other devices chimed softly. Subtle notifications, quiet confirmations, the kind that did not need to be announced because everyone could feel what they meant. The analyst checked his own tablet, eyes scanning quickly, then stopping, his breath catching just slightly. "There are changes in the system," he said under his breath, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that the words joined the air. On the screen behind Jordan, the head of legal continued without hesitation. "Executive action has been initiated," she stated. "Role-based permissions are being reassigned effective immediately." Claire looked up, her expression tightening, trying to process what was happening in real time. "You cannot just remove operational authority without review," she said, but the statement lacked the certainty it once carried. Because the review had already happened. She had lived it. Jordan did not raise his voice. He did not step back. He simply stood there, watching the moment unfold with the same calm he had carried from the beginning. "It was reviewed," he said quietly. "You just did not know you were part of it." The distinction settled heavily. This was not sudden. It was not reactive. It was deliberate. The hallway seemed smaller now, not physically, but in the way every person became more aware of their place within it. A manager from down the corridor approached slowly, drawn by the tension, his badge visible, his posture confident at first. But as he reached the edge of the group and saw the screen, saw the faces, saw Jordan standing at the center of it all, that confidence faltered. He glanced at Claire, waiting for direction, but she did not give any, because she no longer could. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was shorter. "Access revoked." The words did not explain themselves. They did not need to. Claire's shoulders stiffened, her grip tightening around the device as if holding it harder might change what it displayed. But nothing changed. The system had already moved on. On the screen, the chief financial officer spoke, his tone steady, detached from the emotion in the room. "Financial authorization layers have been updated," he said. "All approvals previously assigned to Claire Whitman are now suspended pending final review." A quiet ripple moved through the employees again. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to signal that everyone understood what had just happened. Authority had shifted. Not temporarily, not conditionally, completely. Claire lifted her gaze slowly, meeting Jordan's eyes again, but this time there was no challenge left in them. Only realization, forming piece by piece, too late to interrupt what had already begun. "This is excessive," she said, her voice lower now, almost searching for something to hold on to. "For a misunderstanding." Jordan's expression remained steady, but his eyes sharpened slightly, not with anger, but with truth that refused to soften itself. "It would have been a misunderstanding," he said, "if you had asked a question." The words landed with finality, because they pointed to the one moment that could have changed everything, and the fact that it had never happened. The analyst looked down again, his voice barely audible. "No one asked," he murmured. The sentence was small, but it carried across the space, touching more than just Claire. Because it did not belong to her alone. It belonged to everyone who had stood there and watched. Jordan turned his gaze briefly across the room, taking in the silence, the shifting posture, the quiet acknowledgement that something had been exposed beyond one person's decision. Then he looked back at the screen, where the board remained steady, precise, waiting, not for permission, for completion. And in that moment, the hallway was no longer reacting. It was witnessing the result of what had already been decided. The system did not hesitate. It continued moving forward with a precision that made resistance feel irrelevant. Claire Whitman stood frozen in place, her phone still in her hand, but now, it looked less like a tool and more like evidence. Around her, the hallway had shifted again, not in noise, but in alignment. People who had once stood casually now stood carefully. Conversations that had once flowed freely were gone, replaced by a silence that listened. Jordan Hayes remained exactly where he had been, but the space around him now carried a different gravity, one that did not need to announce itself to be understood. On the screen, the board chair leaned forward slightly, her presence sharpening as the process reached its next phase. "Final confirmation required," she said, her voice calm, controlled, but unmistakably decisive. "Proceed with executive resolution." The words did not rush. They settled, giving the moment one last opportunity to be fully understood before it crossed into something permanent. Claire inhaled slowly, her chest rising as if she were about to speak her way back into control, but the words did not come. Because nothing she could say would return what had already been taken. Her authority had not been challenged. It had been replaced. "This is not how leadership works," she said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence that once carried it. "You do not make decisions like this based on a single interaction." Jordan's eyes held hers, steady, unwavering. "It was never a single interaction," he replied. "It was a reflection." The distinction landed with weight, because it meant this moment was not isolated. It was representative. On the screen, the head of legal nodded once, confirming alignment with the statement. "Patterns have been identified," she said. "This interaction aligns with previously unreported conduct indicators." A subtle shift moved through the employees again, but this time it carried something deeper than discomfort. Recognition. The kind that comes when people realize they have seen something before, but chose not to name it. The analyst lifted his head slightly, his voice hesitant but clearer than before. "This was not the first time," he said, not loudly, but enough to be heard. Claire turned toward him, her eyes narrowing, searching for support, but found none. Because the room had already moved past that need. Jordan did not react to the statement. He did not need to. The system had already accounted for it. Instead, he took a slow breath, his posture unchanged, his presence still grounded in the same quiet control he had carried from the beginning. "Leadership is not about what you do when people are watching," he said calmly. "It is about what you assume when they are not." The words settled into the space, filling the silence with something heavier than sound. On the screen, the chief financial officer gave a slight nod. "All departments have acknowledged the update," he said. "No objections recorded." That was the final layer. Not just authority, but agreement. Not forced. Not demanded. Accepted. Claire's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension no longer holding its shape. Not because she chose to release it, but because there was nothing left for it to support. Her role had already shifted out from under her. She looked at Jordan again, but this time not as someone she needed to correct or control, but as someone she had failed to recognize when it mattered. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice no longer carrying resistance, only the weight of consequence. Jordan did not answer immediately. He let the question sit, not to create suspense, but to make sure it was fully felt. Because what came next was not just about her. It was about everyone who had been part of the moment, whether through action or silence. Then he turned slightly toward the screen, acknowledging the board once more. "Complete the process," he said. The words were simple, but they carried finality. On the screen, the board chair gave a single, decisive nod. "Executive resolution confirmed," she said. "Effective immediately." Somewhere in the system, unseen but undeniable, the last layer shifted into place. And in the hallway, where it had all begun with a single assumption, the outcome was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The confirmation did not echo, but it changed everything. It settled into the system like a lock clicking into place, quiet, precise, irreversible. Claire Whitman felt it before she fully understood it, a shift that did not come from the screen, but from within the structure she had once moved through without resistance. Her badge, still clipped neatly to her blazer, suddenly felt heavier, like it belonged to a version of her that no longer existed. She looked down at it for a brief second, then back up at Jordan, her expression no longer guarded, no longer defiant, but searching for something that could not be restored. Around them, the employees had stopped pretending. They were no longer observers trying to stay out of it. They were witnesses, fully aware that what had just happened was not just about one decision, but about a standard being drawn in real time. The analyst stepped back another inch, creating space not out of fear, but out of recognition. He understood now that proximity meant accountability. On the screen, the head of legal continued, her voice steady, almost clinical in its clarity. "Termination of role-based authority is now complete," she said. "All system access associated with Claire Whitman has been permanently revoked." The word permanently did not raise its volume, but it carried more weight than anything else that had been said. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her phone, but she did not look at it again. She already knew what it would show. The system had moved past her. Not paused, not reconsidered. Moved on. "You did not even speak to me before deciding this," she said quietly, her voice no longer reaching for control, only trying to make sense of the pace at which everything had unfolded. Jordan's gaze remained steady. "You did not speak to me before deciding who I was," he replied. The symmetry of it settled heavily between them, because it removed any argument of fairness. It reflected the exact same standard back, unchanged. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, not in submission, but in the quiet realization that there had been a moment, a single moment, where everything could have gone differently. And it had passed without notice. On the screen, the board chair spoke again, her voice measured, carrying the weight of final oversight. "All departments have been notified of the change," she said. "Interim leadership protocols are now active." "Hey." Manager further down the hallway checked his device again, his expression shifting as he processed the update. He looked up at Jordan, not with confusion, but with a clear understanding of where authority now rested. The hallway did not erupt. It did not react loudly. It adjusted. That was the difference. The structure of the place, invisible but powerful, had recalibrated itself around a new center. Jordan Hayes stood in that center, not elevated, not dramatic, just present in a way that made everything else align. He glanced once more at the rag still on the floor, then back at the space around him, taking in the quiet aftermath of something that had not required force to change everything. "This was not about removing you," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the silence. "It was about revealing what was already there." The words did not accuse. They clarified, and that made them harder to reject. Claire looked at him again, her posture no longer rigid, no longer structured by authority, but by the weight of consequence. "And everyone else?" she asked softly, her voice almost lost in the stillness. Jordan's gaze shifted briefly across the employees, each one now standing differently than they had before, each one aware in their own way of what they had seen, what they had allowed, what they had learned. "They decide what happens next," he said. The statement did not assign blame. It handed responsibility. On the screen, the board remained silent now, their role complete, their presence no longer driving the moment, only confirming it. The system had done what it was designed to do, but what remained in the hallway was something no system could enforce. A standard, a line that had been drawn not in policy, but in action. And as the silence held, one thing became clear to everyone standing there. This was not the end of the moment. It was the beginning of everything that would follow it. The hallway did not return to movement right away. It stayed suspended, as if everyone understood that stepping too quickly would mean missing something important that had just been revealed. Jordan Hayes did not rush to fill the silence. He let it stretch, let it settle into the people standing there, because silence had always been where the truth became unavoidable. The employees shifted subtly, not to leave, but to reposition themselves in a space that no longer felt the same. The analyst finally lifted his head again, his eyes moving from the screen to Jordan, then briefly to Claire, as if trying to understand how all three could exist in the same moment, yet represent completely different realities. Claire Whitman stood still, her posture no longer defined by authority, but by the absence of it. The structure she had relied on had not collapsed. It had simply continued without her. That difference was harder to accept. "So that is it," she said quietly, her voice steady but stripped of its former certainty. "Everything changes in a few minutes." Jordan looked at her, not with judgment, but with a clarity that did not soften itself. "No," he said. "Everything was already like this. You just saw it today." The words did not challenge. They revealed, and that made them harder to resist. Around them, a few employees exchanged brief glances, the kind that carried more meaning than conversation, because they understood now that this moment was not isolated. It was a reflection of something that had been present long before Jordan walked in. The manager who had approached earlier took a cautious step forward, his voice measured, careful. "What do you want us to do?" he asked, not out of confusion, but out of recognition that direction now came from somewhere different. Jordan's gaze shifted to him, then slowly across the group, taking in each face, each reaction, each silent acknowledgement. "Start by asking," he said, "before you decide." The simplicity of the instruction made it heavier, because it meant the solution had never been complex. It had just been ignored. On the screen, the board remained present but quiet now, no longer leading, only observing the aftermath of what had been set in motion. Their role had been to confirm. What happened next belonged to the people in the room. Claire let out a slow breath, her eyes lowering for a moment, not in defeat, but in the quiet realization of something she could not undo. "I thought I was protecting the company," she said, her voice softer now, more reflective than defensive. Jordan did not interrupt. He allowed the statement to exist, to be fully heard before responding. "You were protecting what you thought the company looked like," he said, "not what it stood for." The distinction landed deeper than anything before it, because it reframed everything, not as a failure of action, but as a failure of perception. The analyst nodded slightly, almost to himself, as if something had finally aligned in a way he could not ignore. "We saw what we expected to see," he murmured. Jordan's gaze returned to him briefly. "That is how it starts," he said, "and that is how it spreads." The hallway remained quiet, but it was no longer the same silence from before. It was active now, thoughtful, a silence that carried reflection instead of avoidance. Claire lifted her eyes again, meeting Jordan's gaze one last time, not as someone trying to regain control, but as someone finally understanding the moment she had missed. "And if we had asked," she said. The question hung there, not seeking an answer, but acknowledging the possibility that had existed. Jordan held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then this would have been a conversation," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that could have been different. Around them, the employees stood still, not because they were unsure what to do, but because they understood that what they did next would define what this moment actually meant. And for the first time since it began, the focus was no longer on what had happened. It was on what would happen because of it. The shift did not end with silence. It began to move through the room in quieter ways, in posture, in tone, in the way people chose their next step. Jordan Hayes remained still for a moment longer, not because he needed time, but because everyone else did. The hallway was no longer holding tension. It was holding awareness, and awareness changed how people moved. The manager who had spoken earlier straightened slightly, his voice more grounded now, less uncertain. "We will adjust," he said, not as a promise, but as a recognition of what was now required. Jordan gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without amplifying it. Because change did not need to be announced. It needed to be practiced. The analyst glanced once more at the floor where the rag still lay, then stepped forward, bending down to pick it up. The action was simple, almost small, but it carried a different meaning now. He did not do it because he was told to. He did it because he understood what it represented. He placed it quietly on the nearby counter, not hiding it, not discarding it, just moving it out of the place where it had been used to define someone. Claire watched the movement, her eyes following it briefly before returning to Jordan. There was no defense left in her expression, only reflection. "I see it now," she said softly. The words were not loud, but they did not need to be. Jordan looked at her, his gaze steady, not validating, not dismissing, just present. "Seeing it is where it starts," he replied. "What you do with it is what matters." The statement did not close the moment. It opened it. Around them, employees began to shift more naturally, not to leave, but to re-engage with the space in a way that felt different from before. Conversations resumed, but quieter, more deliberate. Not because they were being watched, but because they had seen what it meant not to pay attention. On the screen, the board members remained for a moment longer, then one by one, their windows began to fade, their presence no longer required. The board chair gave a final nod before her image disappeared, leaving the hallway to itself again. But it was not the same hallway. It could not be. Jordan glanced once more across the room, taking in the faces, the posture, the shift that had already begun. Then he spoke, his voice calm, clear, carrying just enough to reach everyone without forcing itself. "This company is not defined by who walks in," he said. "It is defined by how they are received." The words settled into the space, not as a command, but as a standard. The kind that did not require enforcement because it could be measured in every interaction. The manager nodded slightly, as if committing it to memory. The analyst stood a little straighter, his earlier hesitation replaced by something more intentional. Even the employees who had remained silent before now carried a different awareness in their expressions. Claire exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering, not in defeat, but in acceptance of what had changed. She did not try to reclaim anything. She did not reach for authority that was no longer hers. She simply stood there, understanding that the moment had already defined its outcome. Jordan turned slightly, his attention shifting toward the far end of the hallway, where the building extended into its usual rhythm. But before he moved, he paused, just long enough to leave one final thought in the air. "Respect is not a title," he said quietly. "It is a decision." Then he stepped forward, not away from the moment, but through it, carrying the same calm presence he had walked in with. And as he moved, the hallway did not return to what it was before. It moved forward, shaped by what had just been revealed, defined not by what had been corrected, but by what would no longer be ignored. The hallway did not watch him leave. It followed him without moving, every eye tracking the quiet shift that had already begun to reshape the space. Jordan Hayes walked with the same steady pace he had entered with, not faster, not slower, but now every step carried a weight that no one could ignore. It was not authority announced. It was authority recognized. Behind him, the employees did not return to their routines immediately. They lingered in that in-between moment, where reflection had not yet turned into action, but it was close. The manager who had spoken earlier turned to his team, his voice lower now, but clearer. "We are going to review everything," he said, not as a command, but as a reset. No one questioned it. Not because they were told to agree, but because they had seen what happened when assumptions replaced understanding. The analyst remained near the counter, his eyes moving once more to the rag he had placed there. For a second, he reached out, adjusting it slightly, as if even its position mattered now. Then, he stepped back, his posture different, more aware, more intentional. He was not the same person who had asked if Jordan belonged. He knew that now. Claire Whitman had not moved from her spot, not because she could not, but because she was still standing in the moment that had already moved past her. Her phone rested loosely in her hand, no longer a tool of control, just an object that had delivered a final message she could not reverse. She watched Jordan's back as he walked further down the hallway, the distance between them growing, but the impact of the moment staying exactly where it had landed. "I built my career on being right," she said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for the space to hold it. The manager glanced at her briefly, then looked away, not dismissing her, but understanding that this part did not belong to him. Claire exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering for a second before lifting again. I never stopped to ask if I was fair. The words were not dramatic. They were not meant to be heard as a statement. They were a realization, spoken out loud because silence would have made them heavier. No one responded. Not because they disagreed, but because the truth of it did not need confirmation. Further down the hallway, Jordan slowed for just a moment, not turning back, not interrupting, but acknowledging in his own way that the moment behind him was still unfolding. He did not need to hear every word. He already understood where it would lead if it was taken seriously. He continued walking, his reflection passing along the glass walls, steady, composed, unchanged. The building around him began to move again, but differently now. Doors opened with more attention. Conversations started with more awareness. Small things, almost invisible, but enough to signal that something had shifted beyond a single event. The manager looked back at his team, his voice steady. "We start with how we see people," he said. "Everything else follows." The analyst nodded once, not out of habit, but because the statement felt grounded in something he had just experienced. Claire finally moved, just a step, her posture no longer defined by position, but by understanding. She did not reach for anything. She did not attempt to reclaim space. She simply stepped out of the center of the moment she had once controlled. And as Jordan reached the end of the hallway, he paused briefly near the exit, not to look back, but to take in the quiet transformation that had already begun. He did not need to stay to enforce it, because the kind of change that mattered did not depend on presence. It depended on what people chose to carry forward when no one was watching. Then he pushed the door open and stepped through, leaving behind not just a hallway, but a standard that would remain long after he was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the sound carried further than it should have, echoing back into the hallway like a final punctuation mark on everything that had just unfolded. Inside, no one rushed to follow. No one called his name, because the moment was no longer about him being there. It was about what remained after he left. The hallway held its shape, but not its old meaning. People stood where they were, not frozen, but grounded in a new awareness that made every movement feel intentional. The manager took a slow breath and looked around, really looked this time, not scanning for performance or output, but for presence. "We start over," he said quietly, and this time the words did not feel like a reaction. They felt like a commitment. The analyst nodded, his posture more aligned, his eyes no longer drifting but focused, aware of the weight even the smallest decision could carry. He glanced once more at the counter where the rag rested, then turned away from it, understanding that it no longer defined the moment. It was just an object again. The meaning had moved on. Claire Whitman stood near the center of the hallway, but she was no longer the center of anything. She looked down at her badge one last time, then slowly unclipped it, holding it in her hand for a second as if measuring its value against what had just been revealed. It felt lighter now, not because it had lost weight, but because it had lost authority. She placed it gently on the counter beside the rag, not as a gesture of defeat, but as an acknowledgement of what had changed. Around her, no one reacted loudly. No one needed to. The action spoke clearly enough on its own. A few employees exchanged quiet looks, not of judgment, but of understanding. Because for the first time, the roles in the room were not assigned by position. They were defined by awareness. The manager stepped forward, his voice steady, grounded. "From this point on," he said, "we verify before we assume. We ask before we act." Every time. There was no applause, no agreement spoken out loud, but the shift was visible in how people stood, how they listened, how they carried the moment forward. It was no longer something that had happened. It was something that was continuing. Outside the building, Jordan Hayes walked into the open air, the city moving around him like it always had, unaware of the quiet transformation that had just taken place inside. He did not check his phone. He did not look back. He did not need confirmation. The system had already responded. What mattered now was whether the people inside would. He paused for a brief second at the edge of the sidewalk, not stopping his movement, just marking the transition between one space and the next. His reflection caught briefly in the glass behind him, the same calm presence, the same quiet certainty. Nothing about him had changed. That was the point. Then he continued forward, blending into the flow of the city, leaving behind a building that would now have to decide what it truly stood for. Inside, the hallway slowly returned to motion, but it was not the same motion as before. It carried intention now. Conversations began with names, not assumptions. Questions replaced directives. Small changes, almost invisible, but enough to signal that something fundamental had shifted. Claire remained by the counter for a moment longer, then stepped away, not toward authority, but toward understanding. And as the day moved forward, one truth settled into every corner of the space, quiet but unshakable. No one there would ever look at someone the same way again. Weeks passed, but the moment did not fade. It did not shrink into a story told in passing or a lesson quietly forgotten. It stayed, not as noise, but as a standard that had quietly rewritten the way the building breathed. The hallway where it all happened looked the same to anyone walking through for the first time. The floors still reflected the ceiling lights. The glass still carried faint reflections of movement. The doors still opened with the same quiet precision. But to the people inside, it was not the same place. It could not be, because they had seen something they could not unsee. The manager now paused before giving direction, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. He asked names. He asked questions. He listened before deciding. And that single shift moved through his team like a current, subtle but undeniable. The analyst no longer hovered at the edge of situations. He stepped in, not to control, but to understand. He remembered the moment his question had landed in the wrong place, and he chose differently every time after that. Small corrections. Consistent ones. The kind that build something stronger than policy ever could. New employees joined the company without knowing the full story, but they felt it in the culture, in the way people spoke, in the way they were greeted, in the way no one was reduced to a role before being recognized as a person. And those who had been there that day carried it differently. Not as guilt, not as fear, but as responsibility. Claire Whitman did not return to that hallway as she once had. Her path moved elsewhere, quieter, less defined by authority and more by reflection. She did not speak about that day often, but when she did not change the story. She did not soften it, because she understood now that the truth did not need editing to matter. It needed to be remembered exactly as it was. Across the city, Jordan Hayes continued his work without announcement, without spectacle. The company moved forward under his leadership, but not because he demanded it, because he defined it. He did not return to that hallway for a long time, and when he did, it was not to check if things had changed. It was to walk through a space that had already chosen to be different. He moved through it the same way he always had. Calm, observant, present. And as he passed through, something quiet but powerful became clear to everyone who recognized him and everyone who did not. The moment had never been about revealing who he was. It had been about revealing who everyone else chose to be when they thought it did not matter. He paused briefly near the center of the hallway, not to recreate the past, but to acknowledge what it had become. Conversations continued around him, natural, respectful, unforced. No one stopped him. No one redirected him. No one assumed anything about him. And that was the difference. He looked ahead, then spoke softly, not to the room, but into the space itself, as if leaving something behind for it to carry forward. I did not need to prove who I was, he said. You proved who you were. The words did not echo, but they stayed. Because they were no longer about that moment. They were about every moment after it. Then he continued walking, not as someone returning to claim a space, but as someone who had already changed it without needing to stay. And in that hallway, where a single assumption had once defined everything, a new truth remained, steady and unshaken. No one there would ever mistake silence for absence again. And no one would ever forget that respect was never about position. It was about choice.